At the first light of dawn, when the Arizona Territory still held the chill of night and the desert winds whispered secrets through the sagebrush, Jack Morrison rode his weathered stallion through the canyon pass that led home to Copper Ridge. 3 months of cattle driving across the unforgiving wilderness had carved new lines into his sun-beaten face, and dust from 1,000 miles clung to his leather chaps like second skin. The familiar silhouette of his ranch buildings emerged through the morning haze, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Where smoke should have been rising from the kitchen chimney, there was only silence. Where his wife Sarah's red hair should have been visible hanging laundry on the line, there was only emptiness. Jack spurred his horse forward, his heart hammering against his ribs with a dread he couldn't name. The well stood at the center of his property like a stone sentinel, its wooden frame stark against the pale morning sky. But hanging from the crossbeam, swaying gently in the desert breeze, was a sight that would haunt Jack Morrison for the rest of his days. Sarah's lifeless body turned slowly in the wind, her vibrant red hair now dulled by death, her green dress torn and stained with the evidence of her final struggle. Pinned to her chest was a crude piece of bark with 3 words carved deep into its surface with the tip of a knife: "Lover of Navajo." Jack's legs gave out beneath him as he stumbled from his horse, his calloused hands shaking as he reached up to cut down the woman who had been his whole world. The sheriff of Copper Ridge, a grizzled man named Tom Bradley who had seen more than his share of frontier violence, arrived within the hour after Jack's frantic ride into town. Bradley examined the scene with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that the desert kept its secrets close and gave them up reluctantly. The rope was new, purchased recently from Martinez's general store in town. The knot was tied with the skill of someone who knew their way around cattle and horses. Most telling of all was the message carved into the bark, its letters formed with deliberate care by someone who wanted to make absolutely certain their meaning was understood. This wasn't a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. This was calculated. This was revenge. But revenge for what? Jack Morrison had always been known as a fair man in his dealings with the local Navajo tribe that lived in the Red Rock country 20 miles south of Copper Ridge. Unlike many of the other ranchers in the territory who viewed the native people with suspicion and hostility, Jack had traded fairly with them, hired their young men for seasonal work, and had even learned to speak enough of their language to conduct business without an interpreter. Sarah, too, had been welcomed among the Navajo women, who had taught her their methods for dyeing wool and weaving patterns that told stories of their ancestors. The accusation carved into that piece of bark made no sense to anyone who knew the Morrisons, yet someone had believed it strongly enough to commit murder. Sheriff Bradley questioned every soul in Copper Ridge over the following days, from the Mexican workers who helped build the railroad through the territory to the traveling merchants who sold supplies to the isolated ranches scattered across the high desert. Old Miguel Santos, who had known Sarah since she was a girl back in Santa Fe, wept openly when he heard the news. Father Patrick O'Brien, the Irish priest who had married Jack and Sarah 3 years earlier, spoke of Sarah's kindness to everyone regardless of their heritage or station in life. Martha Williams, who ran the town's only boarding house, recalled how Sarah had spent hours teaching the local children to read, including several young Navajo boys whose parents worked on the surrounding ranches. Every testimony painted the same picture of a woman incapable of the betrayal suggested by her murderer's message. The first real clue emerged when Bradley discovered that Sarah had been seen arguing with someone behind the church 2 days before Jack's return. Martha Williams had glimpsed the confrontation from her boarding house window, but could only make out Sarah's distinctive red hair and the broad shoulders of a tall man in a dark coat. The conversation had appeared heated, with Sarah gesturing emphatically and the unknown man standing rigid as a fence post. When Martha looked again minutes later, both figures had vanished. This revelation sent Bradley riding hard to every ranch and mining claim within 50 miles, seeking any man who might have had reason to threaten Sarah Morrison. The investigation led him down a twisted path of land disputes, water rights, and the kind of old grudges that festered in isolated communities where people had too much time to nurse their grievances. The second hook came when Bradley discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about the case. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the Morrison ranch house was a collection of letters tied with a blue ribbon, letters that Sarah had apparently kept secret from her husband. The correspondence was signed with only the initial R and spoke of clandestine meetings, passionate encounters, and promises of a future together far from the judgment of Copper Ridge. The letters painted a picture of Sarah Morrison that contradicted everything Jack and the townspeople believed about her character. According to these carefully preserved documents, Sarah had indeed been conducting an affair, but not with any member of the Navajo tribe. Her lover was someone much closer to home, someone whose identity was hidden behind that single, damning letter. Jack Morrison's world crumbled a second time as Sheriff Bradley read portions of the letters aloud in the privacy of the jailhouse office. The woman he had loved and trusted above all others had been living a double life, meeting secretly with another man while Jack drove cattle across the territory to support their dreams of expanding the ranch. The letters spoke of Sarah's desire to leave Copper Ridge forever, to start fresh in California where no one would know their story. They revealed plans that had been made for her disappearance, arrangements that would have made it appear as though she had simply vanished into the vast wilderness that swallowed so many travelers in those days. But something had gone wrong. Instead of running away with her mysterious lover, Sarah had ended up hanging from the well that Jack had dug with his own hands to provide water for their future children. The hunt for R consumed Bradley's every waking hour as he methodically worked through every male resident of Copper Ridge whose name began with that letter. Robert Martinez, the general store owner, had been in Santa Fe visiting his ailing mother during the week of the murder. Richard Thompson, the town's banker, was a 60-year-old man with arthritis who could barely saddle his own horse, let alone overpower a strong young woman like Sarah. Ralph Henderson, who owned the largest ranch in the territory, had been laid up with a broken leg after being thrown from a bronco. One by one, Bradley eliminated the obvious suspects, but the list of possibilities seemed endless when he expanded his search to include ranch hands, traveling salesmen, and anyone else who might have used an initial rather than a full signature. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Father O'Brien approached Bradley with information that had been weighing heavily on his conscience. 3 weeks before Sarah's death, she had come to him seeking guidance about a matter she claimed she couldn't discuss with anyone else in town. The priest was bound by the sanctity of confession and couldn't reveal the specific details of their conversation, but he could tell Bradley that Sarah had been terrified of someone and had begged for advice on how to escape a situation that had spiraled beyond her control. She had spoken of being trapped by decisions she had made in loneliness and desperation while Jack was away on his cattle drives. Most importantly, she had mentioned being afraid that this person would harm not just her, but Jack as well when he returned. This revelation cast Sarah's death in an entirely different light. Rather than being the victim of a jealous husband who had discovered his wife's infidelity, she might have been murdered by the very man she had been trying to leave behind. The letters hidden in her home could have been kept as evidence of the affair rather than treasured keepsakes. Insurance against a lover who had become dangerous when she tried to end their relationship. The message carved into the bark and pinned to her body might have been a deliberate attempt to misdirect suspicion away from the real killer and toward the Navajo people, knowing that racial tensions in the territory would make such an accusation readily believable to many residents of Copper Ridge. Sheriff Bradley's investigation took on new urgency as he realized that Jack Morrison might also be in danger from someone who had already committed murder to protect their secrets. The killer had demonstrated both cunning and ruthlessness in staging Sarah's death to look like the work of Native Americans seeking revenge for some imagined slight. This suggested someone with intimate knowledge of local prejudices and tensions, someone who understood exactly how to manipulate the assumptions and fears of the community. The murderer was likely someone Jack trusted, someone who had access to the Morrison Ranch and knowledge of Jack's travel schedule. The net was closing, but Bradley feared it might not close quickly enough to prevent another death. The answer came from the most unlikely source when 10-year-old Billy Martinez, son of the general store owner, approached Bradley with a story he had been afraid to tell. The boy had been fishing in the creek that ran behind the Morrison property on the morning of Sarah's murder, hoping to catch trout for his family's breakfast. He had seen a man on horseback approaching the ranch house just as the sun was rising, someone Billy recognized but had been too frightened to identify until now. The rider had been Richard "Rick" Dalton, the territory's deputy marshal who was supposed to be Bradley's most trusted ally in law enforcement. Dalton, whose initial was indeed R, and who had the authority and knowledge necessary to commit the perfect crime while deflecting suspicion onto innocent parties. The confrontation between Bradley and Dalton took place at sunset in the main street of Copper Ridge, with most of the town's population gathered to witness what they sensed would be a climactic moment in the mystery that had consumed their community. Dalton initially denied everything, claiming that Billy Martinez was mistaken and that he had been in the territorial capital on official business during the time of Sarah's murder. But when Bradley produced the letters found in Sarah's house and pointed out that the handwriting matched official documents Dalton had filed in previous cases, the deputy marshal's facade began to crumble. The man who had helped investigate Sarah Morrison's death had been her killer all along, using his position and authority to direct suspicion away from himself and toward the convenient scapegoats he had identified in his carefully planted message. The truth, when it finally emerged in Dalton's confession, was uglier than anyone in Copper Ridge had imagined. Rick Dalton had indeed been Sarah's secret lover, beginning their affair during one of Jack's extended absences when loneliness and isolation had made Sarah vulnerable to the attentions of a smooth-talking lawman who promised her excitement and romance. What had started as a brief dalliance had evolved into something more serious when Sarah discovered she was carrying Dalton's child. Faced with the prospect of disgrace and the destruction of both their reputations, Dalton had initially promised to take Sarah away from Copper Ridge and start a new life together. But as Jack's return approached and the reality of their situation set in, Dalton's promises had turned to threats when Sarah demanded that he honor his commitments. The final confrontation between Sarah and Dalton had taken place not behind the church as Martha Williams had witnessed, but at the Morrison Ranch in the pre-dawn hours before Jack's expected arrival. Sarah had given Dalton an ultimatum. Either he would take her away as promised, or she would confess everything to Jack and Sheriff Bradley. Consequences be damned. Rather than accept exposure and disgrace, Dalton had chosen murder, staging the scene to implicate the Navajo people and counting on territorial prejudices to prevent a thorough investigation. He had underestimated both Bradley's integrity and the community's genuine respect for Sarah Morrison, factors that had ultimately led to his undoing despite his careful planning and advantageous position. Justice in the Arizona Territory was swift and final in those days, and Rick Dalton's execution by hanging took place on the same spot where he had murdered Sarah Morrison. Jack Morrison watched from the crowd that gathered to witness the end of the man who had destroyed his life and betrayed the badge he had sworn to honor. There was no satisfaction in Dalton's death for Jack, only a hollow sense of completion and the knowledge that Sarah's killer would never harm anyone else. In the months that followed, Jack sold his ranch and left Copper Ridge forever, unable to bear the memories that haunted every familiar landmark and building. Some said he headed north to Montana Territory to start over with nothing but his horse and his grief for company. The case of Sarah Morrison's murder became legendary in the annals of territorial law enforcement, studied by sheriffs and marshals throughout the Southwest as an example of how appearances could deceive and how those entrusted with upholding justice could become its greatest enemies. Sheriff Tom Bradley continued serving Copper Ridge for another 20 years, but he never forgot the lessons learned from that terrible spring when a cowboy returned at dawn to find his world destroyed by betrayal and murder. The story served as a reminder that in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, the greatest dangers often came not from the wilderness itself, but from the darkness that could lurk in human hearts, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature to a world unprepared for its cruelty. The years that followed Rick Dalton's execution brought changes to Copper Ridge that no one could have anticipated when the first shock of Sarah Morrison's murder still echoed through the desert canyons. Sheriff Tom Bradley found himself transformed by the case, his faith in human nature forever altered by the discovery that evil could wear a badge and speak with the voice of authority. He began training younger deputies with an intensity that bordered on obsession, drilling into them the importance of questioning everything and trusting no one completely, not even their fellow lawmen. Bradley's reputation spread throughout the Arizona Territory as a sheriff who left no stone unturned and no assumption unexamined, traits that served him well in the lawless frontier where appearances meant nothing and survival depended on seeing through deception. The Navajo tribe that had been falsely accused in Dalton's desperate attempt to misdirect justice received an official apology from the territorial government, one of the first such acknowledgments of wrongdoing toward Native Americans in that era. Chief Running Bear, who had known both Jack and Sarah Morrison as honest traders, accepted the apology with the dignity that characterized his dealings with the white settlers who had claimed his people's ancestral lands. The incident had strained relations between the tribe and Copper Ridge initially, but the truth of Dalton's guilt ultimately strengthened the bonds of trust that the Morrisons had worked so hard to build. Several young Navajo men continued working on the remaining ranches in the area, their presence a living reminder that justice had prevailed over prejudice in at least this one instance. Father Patrick O'Brien struggled with his own demons in the aftermath of the case, tormented by the knowledge that Sarah had come to him seeking help and guidance in her final weeks. The priest had been bound by the sanctity of confession and could not have revealed the specific details of Sarah's fears, but he wondered constantly whether he might have found some way to protect her without violating his sacred oaths. O'Brien began dedicating more of his sermons to the themes of redemption and second chances, speaking to congregations filled with people who carried their own secrets and regrets. His words took on a depth and compassion born from witnessing firsthand how quickly life could be destroyed by poor choices and malevolent intentions. Martha Williams, whose sharp eyes had provided one of the crucial clues in solving the case, became something of a legend in Copper Ridge as the woman who saw everything that happened in town from her boarding house window. Travelers and new residents quickly learned that nothing escaped Martha's attention, and her testimony had become the gold standard for reliability in Sheriff Bradley's investigations. She took a protective interest in the young women who passed through town, offering them advice and shelter when needed, determined that no other Sarah Morrison would face her troubles alone and unprotected. Martha's boarding house became an unofficial sanctuary for those seeking refuge from dangerous situations or abusive relationships. The Morrison Ranch stood empty for several months after Jack's departure, its buildings slowly surrendering to the relentless desert winds that scoured the high country of Arizona Territory. Eventually, a family named the Hendersons purchased the property, drawn by the good water rights and the solid construction of the house and outbuildings. They knew the history of the place, but frontier pragmatism demanded that good land not remain unused simply because tragedy had occurred there. The new owners filled the well that had been the site of Sarah's murder, drilling a new one several hundred yards away, and gradually the ranch began to show signs of life again as children's laughter replaced the silence that had haunted the property. Billy Martinez, the young boy whose courage in coming forward had ultimately solved the case, grew up to become a lawman himself, inspired by Sheriff Bradley's example of thorough investigation and unwavering integrity. Billy never forgot the lesson he had learned about the importance of speaking truth even when it was frightening or difficult, and he carried that principle with him throughout his career in law enforcement. As an adult, he often spoke to school children about civic duty and moral courage, using his own small part in solving Sarah Morrison's murder as an example of how even the youngest member of a community could make a difference when justice was at stake. The letters that had been found hidden in Sarah's house were eventually burned in a ceremony attended by Sheriff Bradley and Father O'Brien, both men agreeing that the secrets they contained had caused enough pain and should not be preserved to hurt anyone else. The act of destroying those documents felt like a final cleansing of the poison that Rick Dalton had introduced into so many lives. Bradley kept only one piece of evidence from the case, the carved bark message that had initially misdirected the investigation, preserving it as a reminder of how easily hatred and prejudice could be manipulated by those with evil intentions. He showed it to every new deputy who worked under him, using it as a teaching tool about the dangers of making assumptions based on fear rather than facts. Jack Morrison's fate remained a mystery that spawned countless stories and legends throughout the territory. Some claim to have seen him working cattle drives in Montana, his red beard now streaked with gray, and his eyes holding the haunted look of a man who had seen too much betrayal. Others insisted he had headed west to California, perhaps seeking the new life that Sarah had dreamed of sharing with her lover before everything went wrong. A few romantics believed he had returned to his family's farm in Missouri, finding peace in the familiar rhythms of a gentler landscape. The truth was that Jack Morrison had simply vanished into the vast anonymity of a growing nation, becoming one of thousands of men who had left their past behind in pursuit of something better or at least something different. The story of Sarah Morrison's murder became part of the oral tradition of Copper Ridge, passed down from parents to children as both entertainment and warning. Over time, the details became embellished and changed, as frontier stories always did, but the core truth remained intact: that evil could wear familiar faces and speak with trusted voices, and that justice required constant vigilance from ordinary people willing to stand up for what was right. The tale served as a reminder that the frontier was being tamed not just by guns and horses, but by the gradual establishment of laws and institutions that protected the innocent and punished the guilty, regardless of their position or authority. Sheriff Tom Bradley retired in 1887, 20 years after solving the Morrison case. His hair white as desert sand and his face carved by decades of desert sun and difficult decisions. On his final day in office, he rode out to the old Morrison ranch to pay his respects at the site where Sarah's body had been discovered. The well had been filled in long ago, but Bradley could still picture the scene as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The young woman's red hair moving in the morning breeze, the carved message that had nearly led justice astray, and the terrible moment when he realized that the real killer had been standing beside him throughout the investigation. He said a quiet prayer for Sarah's soul and for Jack's peace, wherever the broken cowboy had finally found it. As the sun set over the Arizona Territory on that final day of Bradley's career, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that Sarah Morrison would have loved, the old sheriff reflected on the lessons learned from that long-ago morning when a cowboy had returned at dawn to find his world destroyed. Justice, Bradley had learned, was not always swift or obvious, and truth had a way of hiding behind the faces of those least suspected of deception. But in the end, patient investigation and moral courage had prevailed over evil and corruption, proving that even on the lawless frontier, there were still those willing to fight for what was right. The case that had defined his career was finally, truly closed, not by the execution of Rick Dalton years earlier, but by the quiet understanding that some stories must be remembered so that their lessons might guide future generations through their own encounters with darkness and betrayal. The wind that had carried Sarah's final breath now carried Sheriff Bradley's horse toward town as the last light faded from the western sky, closing the book on one of the most infamous murder cases in territorial history and leaving behind only the eternal silence of the desert, keeper of so many secrets and witness to so many endings.